Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you here. My name is Sheen, and I'm the webinar coordinator for the reading and vocabulary interest section at TESOL. And today it is our great pleasure to have Professor Louise joining us to talk about supporting Indigenous multilingual learners. So just a brief introduction of Professor Louise. Professor Luis Javier Panton Herrera serves as the 38th president of Maryland TESOL in 2018 to 2019, and he currently serves as assistant professor at the University of Warsaw, Poland, in the Faculty of Modern Languages and the Institute of Applied Linguistics. And he also serves as the coordinator of the graduate TESOL certificate at the Georgia Washington University, United States. So let's give a big props to Professor Luis, and I will hand it over to him.
Thank you very much, Shane, and for that presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. Thank you for joining this presentation. Maria Luisa, I see that you're from you're joining us from Mexico City, and I think the rest of the participants perhaps from some parts of the US or maybe overseas. So that's wonderful. We have people from different parts of the world. So thank you for joining us. Today, I will be talking about, as we can see here, supporting Indigenous multilingual learners, exploring issues of vulnerability, social equity, and double standard. And more than anything, I don't want this to be a lecture. I want this to be a conversation. So as I go through the presentation and the slides, please write in the chat box. I'm actually pulling up the chat box here so I can see your comments and your reactions. And let's have conversations, okay? More than anything, that's what I want, for us to learn from each other during this conversation that we're having. So just a brief overview here of the presentation and the information that we're going to talk about. In essence, I'm going to talk about, introduce who Indigenous multilingual learners are, and talk about some of the realities that they're facing in US schools specifically. Also, of course, thinking back to the realities in the countries of origin, Latin America, because that affects the reality in US schools, and then how to best support them, okay? So that's kind of like a brief overview there for you to look at. And I do have an agenda that I'm going to share with you. But before I do that, let me share with you that when I was getting ready for this presentation during the weekend, I had this wonderful, wonderful email and wonderful news that the US Justice Department secured an agreement with Massachusetts School District to ensure equal educational opportunities for all students, including Quiché students. And this was, I had the opportunity to thankfully collaborate with the Justice Department, US Justice Department, to share some resources with them when they were preparing for this case. And the case was that there was a lawsuit against this school district because Quiché speakers, specifically, it's a Mayan group, was not being appropriately served in supporting those schools. So I was very, very happy to learn that they actually, they secured the agreement, and then steps are going to be taking place now to ensure equal opportunities for Quiché speakers. I was over the moon, and what a better time to learn about this than, a few days before I was preparing for the presentation. I do have the link here for you, and I'm going to share all of these PowerPoint presentations and all the links, all of the resources. I'll share everything with you. I do tend to have a lot of text in the PowerPoints, in the slides, but I do that so you can look at it later if you have some time, or look at the links. And, all of those are resources that you can look at. To my knowledge, this is the second big case like this that happens in the US, where lawsuits are filed against school districts. The first one, and I took a note here, this actually, I came across this first lawsuit when I was finishing my PhD in 2018. And in May 2016, the Ohio Immigrant Worker, it's a group, they filed a lawsuit against the Dover City Schools for discrimination against Ichil students. And another Mayan group of students, and they actually, the lawsuit was settled in favor of the Ohio Immigrant Workers School. And, so the schools had to provide appropriate resources and supports towards Ixil students. So now I see also Quiche speakers. So, we're seeing more and more, thankfully, more lawsuits being won for, in favor of Indigenous students, which is what we want for our students in school. So I'm glad also to see that they're becoming more and more visible in schools, in the law, in the United States in general. Okay, so I wanted to start with those good news, and then we'll go here into the agenda for today. This is how I'm dividing the presentation today. So very briefly, we'll talk about Indigenous students, then vulnerability, which is a topic that I started looking at. I think, we've kind of neglected a little bit of about the topic of vulnerability in students and schools, because people feel that vulnerability makes you feel vulnerable, or if you're researching vulnerability, there is a vulnerable side to it. But, I'm interested in that, and I'll share some of my ideas with you. And then I'll talk about social emotional learning and academic needs of Indigenous students, and then supporting print literacy, and some of the work that I did with my colleagues to support their print literacies, okay? So before I begin, I would love to hear from you. And if you can write in the chat box, what grade level and content do you teach? If I can have that information in the chat box, please, just to learn a little bit about you and have some knowledge about your background. So do you teach, for example, elementary, middle school, high school, higher education? Then what content? So let me share with you here mine so you can see an example. Fatima, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, and all are welcome, okay? All are welcome. Thank you. For me, it's higher education. I'm writing it here in the chat box. And the content I teach is languages, linguistics. So I see here for some of you, university linguistics, ESL, world languages, okay, elementary and higher education. Thank you, Juliana. I am Quechua. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I have an article I can share with you. Email me if you'd like to learn more about the work that I'm doing with Quechua speakers in the US. Laura, an educational writer. Let me see here. I have my glasses on and I keep seeing less and less. Maybe I need a new prescription. Yeah, teach English at the university. Wonderful, wonderful. Helene, wonderful to see you here. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So I think we have cross-cultural communication. Wonderful, Natalia. Thank you. So we have a mostly university, but we do have different other groups here. So that's wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for writing that in the chat box. And I'll continue now. Juliana, definitely email me. I'm very interested, please. Definitely email me. And you can all email me at any time as well. Okay, so let me continue here. So throughout the conversation that we're having today, I have some slides with some quotes and voices from the field, just to bring to life the topic that we're talking about. This is a quote that I really like, and I think it's going to help us set the pace and a little bit of background for the conversation. So as the Indigenous people have experienced racism in the past, this experience continues in today's society because they're often being marginalized as they enter the educational system that includes very little of their histories, cultures, and heritages in curriculum and practice. So this is something that I really want to highlight here, because when we think about Indigenous students and just Indigenous culture in general, formal schooling continues to make invisible everything that is related to Indigenous peoples, especially in that side of the world, which is Latin America. And I'm talking about also the US. Canada is starting to recognize, and they're taking some steps now to correct the colonial mindset, the colonial practices that have been embedded in formal education. This is not a topic for today's conversation, but formal schooling, we have to keep in mind that formal schooling was the practice that actively sought to eradicate indigenous languages, indigenous peoples. And boarding schools, when you think about boarding schools happen in Canada, the US, in Latin America, and that was formal education. That was the form of erasure that they used to make indigenous identities, indigenous cultures invisible, to punish children for being indigenous and for using their languages and for using their cultures and for looking indigenous. So we have to think about that when we think about formal education. And when indigenous children go into formal education, it doesn't look like boarding schools today, but very much the same colonial mentality exists in today's schools. And that's the reality. That's why indigenous children continue to be, especially indigenous youth, continue to be one of the most under-researched populations in academic research in general when it comes to education, okay? So let's go over indigenous students. Who are indigenous students? Another poll here. Like I said, I want this to be a conversation, not a lecture, okay? So, oops, let me go back, sorry. Have you ever worked with or supported indigenous students and or families? I just want to have a general overview here. So to see how deep I need to go about your knowledge with indigenous students. Have you ever worked with any indigenous students and or families? Could be yes, no, maybe. And we have to, unfortunately, no such experience, not in the US. Katie, thank you very much, not really. And we have to remember that sometimes, indigenous, when we think about indigenous, many people think about only the way that people may look like or the fact that they speak that language, but there is more than that, right? Many people actually hide their indigenous identity for fear of persecution or for fear of being the discrimination, all of these things. So maybe you might have been working with populations that perhaps are indigenous, but they're just hiding that part of their identity. Yes, one adult from whom I learned to pay attention. Martha, thank you very much. That's interesting. Both with indigenous people who self-identify and some who did not identify. Juliana, yes, in early days. Bilingual tribal schools, Margaret, that's wonderful. I'd love to hear more about that experience in adult education in a community center, Laura. Thank you very much for sharing, everyone. Thank you. So we have a little bit of a mixed group here. So let me just start with some of the misconceptions here, which is often very much found in schooling today. And a lot of these conversations that we're having today are guided by my experience teaching elementary, middle, high school in the US. And when I talk about indigenous students, specifically, I'm referring to indigenous students from Latin American countries coming to the US, okay? Some misconceptions that formal education, formal schooling people have about Latinx, Latinos, Hispanic populations is that all people from Latin America speak Spanish. And that's certainly not true. I remember one time in school, because I often served as translator, teacher, translator, interpreter, everything that they needed, Spanish support with, I would do that. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps moving. And then I remember one time we had a student from Brazil and they called me to the front desk and then they said, Luis, can you translate? And then they started speaking Portuguese. And I looked at the front register lady and I told her, that's not Spanish, that's Portuguese. She's like, he's from Latin America. He should be speaking Spanish. And I'm like, no, Brazil speaks Portuguese. So, not all people from Latin America speak Spanish. Definitely Brazil is the biggest country that does not speak Spanish, but there are other countries as well, Belize, Guyana, Suriname, you name it. But in addition to that, even Latin American countries that speak Spanish or consider Spanish to be their kind of the language of the land, right? Actually, those countries have large populations of indigenous speakers and indigenous groups, okay? I'll share more in the next slides. All Latinos or Hispanics feel empowered by this descriptor. No, this is not true. Not all Latino students feel empowered by this. Not all Latinos or Hispanics feel connected to this descriptor. Sometimes it's just imposed on them and they just don't know what else to say or how to react, and they have to be placed in a box. That's part of the practices in formal education, but they don't feel any connection or empowerment coming from that. Okay, especially indigenous populations. All students coming from Latin America identify as Spanish speakers and or Latinos, Hispanics. Again, no, not all of them. Okay, so we have to be very aware of this. I had indigenous students who they just said, I'm indigenous, I'm not a Spanish speaker, I'm not, and we have to be aware that not all indigenous students speak Spanish. Also something to consider. The next one. And please, if you have comments or questions, write in the chat box. As I said, I want this to be a conversation. We Latinos all love the fact that we're connected to Spain and the Spanish language. No, certainly no, okay? And in Latin America, I'm starting to see more and more, thankfully, an awareness, rediscovery of our indigenous roots. And even in countries like the Caribbean, Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries like Cuba, I'm from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. Traditionally, those three countries have been told again and again and again that our Taino is the indigenous people of those three islands. Puerto Rico had another group, same with Cuba, but Tainos are kind of the biggest indigenous group that used to live in those three islands. And history told us again and again and again that the Tainos were all killed and all erased by the Spaniards. And that's not true. And we're seeing more and more that we do have Taino roots. We see it in our families. We see it in, some of us are starting to take DNA tests, and we're seeing it in our DNA tests as well. So we're seeing it in the language that we speak. The words that we use in Spanish come from the Taino language. And we only use it in those three islands. So it's still part of us, and we're becoming more aware of that fact, and we're becoming to embrace a little bit more the fact that we are Tainos, and we're trying to recuperate that part of our identity. So no, we don't feel connected to Spain. We don't feel connected to the Spanish language. Some of us might have a mixture of identities, Tainos, African, Spanish, and that's, kind of 3 in 1, especially the Caribbean islands. That's the reality, we're a mix. But, not all students feel like that, especially indigenous students who are indigenous only and do not have any connection to Spain or Spanish people. Okay, so something to be very aware of here. And then last but not least, Latino students, Latino, and I put it in quotation marks, that's an ongoing debate with what term to use. Latino students, especially multilingual learners and or English language learners from Latin American countries, benefit from support in Spanish, their first language. And that's another misconception. For many indigenous students, Spanish is not their first language. I had students who spoke Spanish as a second language, even third language, and then they were learning English as a third or fourth language. So we have to really take how we're going to scaffold or differentiate instruction. We have to take this in like one by one basis. We have to learn more about our students, what they need, what they benefit from the most, and I'll share some examples in the next slide. But I just wanted to start with these misconceptions to get us started and to start thinking about the way that we look at Latino students or students from Latin America. So I always like to start with this story. And when I started school, my teacher preparation programs, they didn't prepare me to know or teach or support indigenous students. I do not remember a single reading in my teacher preparation programs. And I went through several teacher preparation programs for different certificates and things. And I do not recall a single reading about indigenous students, especially indigenous students from Latin America. And, in my mindset, I went to school in Cuba all the way to high school, and they still have this colonial mentality of all Tainos were killed. There were primitive people. There were, salvages, like all of these things. Very much colonial words, mindset. And I was like, okay, everybody in Latin America speaks Spanish because that's what they taught me in Cuba growing up. So I had all of this mentality that Spanish is the only language in Latin America. There are no more indigenous people. I was very ignorant. I was not aware of the reality, right? So thankfully, and it is true that teachers, we learn the most from our students. I had this student who I called Diego. And I remember one day I was teaching the verb to be in our ESOL class. And I kept explaining the verb to be, I am, you are, and you can think about it in Spanish like this way. And I was giving the English and Spanish equivalent. And then I had this student, pseudonym, we're calling him Diego. I'm like, Diego, are you getting this? And he's like, no. And he would look down and like he was not getting it. I'm like, Diego, and then I gave everybody some work, independent work. And then I sat down with Diego. I'm like, Diego, mijo, I've explained this a few times already. I'm giving you the Spanish equivalent, the way that we conjugate it. I mean, what am I doing wrong? At this point, I was feeling pretty like a pretty terrible teacher. I'm not doing something correct, right? And then Diego confessed to me that he was actually a Mayan speaker, an Ichil speaker, and that he was learning Spanish at the same time that he was learning English. And then I noticed also that his Spanish, some of the words that he used were not what we call conventional standard Spanish, so I noticed that he was learning Spanish at the same time. It was in the beginning of the school year. And I just paused for a moment. And I said, Diego, where are you from? Aren't you from Guatemala? It's like, yes. I'm like, then you should be speaking Spanish. You should know Spanish, right? No, I'm Maya from Guatemala. I'm indigenous. I'm Ichil. I'm like, what? And my world just flipped because I did not understand. He turned my world upside down. He kind of shattered everything I thought I knew that I have been taught in Cuba and in the US. When they keep saying Latinos, Hispanics, and I'm like, okay, everybody speaks Spanish in Latin America. And I had to really, I felt bad because then I realized, okay, my instruction has just been focusing on supporting Latin American students or students from Latin America who are Spanish speakers. But what about Diego? What about other students who might be indigenous? Now I don't know who is indigenous and who is not. And initially I did not know the background of not only the language, but beyond that, everything that comes with being indigenous in Latin America and then in the United States. And I had to learn very, very fast. So you can read more about this story. I wrote about this. For me, it was transformative. Diego just changed my worldview. And you can read the full article as you see it there in the slide down there. It has the full article. So when I share the PowerPoint with you, please, if you're interested. Martha, what readings do you recommend about Indigenous students for pre-sev? Can you put the URL into the chat? Yes, let me see. Hold on, let me see if I can get it here. This is the URL. But Martha, email me, and there aren't many publications out there, but I can definitely share with you some specific names of people who are doing fantastic work with Indigenous students. David Chong, he's Maya himself. Casanova, Saskia's Casanova, it's another one, she's wonderful. She's also Maya. Gavi Kovacs, Melissa Messinas, she's another wonderful person. Luis Urrieta, he's like the big name. He's also indigenous. All of them are indigenous, and I've had the pleasure of working and collaborating with them. I'll be glad to share some of my work with you. Email me, please. I'll be glad to share everything that I have with you, okay? So again, this is kind of my introduction to indigenous students, thankfully through Diego. And as I share with you, I'll be sharing some facts. Do you know that it is estimated that there are approximately 655 to 826 indigenous groups living in Latin America? Look at that number, 655 to 826 indigenous groups. That's pretty significant, when we think about Latin America and all the languages that they represent. So Spanish, it's significant when we think about Spanish is not the only language in Latin America, okay? So very important. It is estimated that there are approximately 551 to 881 indigenous languages spoken in Latin America today. You have the link there also to check it out when I share the PowerPoint presentation, okay? There are many, many languages to consider, okay? So Spanish is not the only language in Latin America. Okay, so let's go deeper into Indigenous students. Those colleagues that I shared their names with you and we've been working, and this is an ongoing conversation that we're having in publications, in the work that we're doing. And it has been difficult to name or put a name to how do we introduce or how do we talk about this indigenous population of students, because of the, when we think about specific words, they have history behind them. Okay, so for example, some publications started talking about Hispanic indigenous students, but you see, when you use the term Hispanic, you're assuming that they speak Spanish, because that's what Hispanic is, Spanish speaking people, Hispanic. Not all indigenous students speak Spanish. So some people push back when some of the literature, some of the scholars, and even myself started using this Hispanic indigenous students, when we started using that phrase to refer to indigenous students. Then we went with indigenous Latinx students. And then for the same reason, some of the misconceptions that I shared with you in the beginning, some people also pushed back and said, and even indigenous communities, they said, we don't identify as Latino because we're not. Latino was a name that was imposed in Latin, from the Spanish speaking people into Latin America. That's not the name that we recognize our land to be called. So we don't identify as Latinos. So in our ongoing conversation, and this is an article that hopefully it's going to come out, I'm hoping by the end of the year, early next year, all of those names that I shared with you earlier, and we got into a conversation that resulted in an article. And then we started really thinking and digging deep, how do we call this population of students? Because the thing is, as we know in academia, we have to have a term that we refer to particular populations. So when we start publishing, then the literature becomes bigger, and then it will be easier for everyone to find more information about those particular, that particular group. If we have different names, then the literature is pretty much spread out, and it's very difficult to locate all the resources available. So then we started thinking and talking, and then we realized that the word diasporic, it's a great fit for this population because they live in diaspora. And when we think about diaspora in the US, Canada, throughout Latin America, that's the population that we're referring to. So we came up with this term of diasporic indigenous students. Okay. And more and more in our publications, instead of referring to Latin America, we're referring to that part of the world as Abya, which is the term that indigenous people and scholars use and recognize the land, which is, again, the Americas. That's how we call it and how we refer to it, okay? Especially indigenous communities. But diasporic indigenous students, we use this term to include all the lived realities of different diverse groups of students, again, living in the US, but also that go back and forth between the US and other parts of Latin America, Abya, however you might want to call it, okay? So again, just giving you some information here about the terminology. So let's go deeper now into this idea of vulnerability. And I was grateful to work with this student, now Dr. Gomez Portillo. He graduated, and I was part of his dissertation. And he did some work with family engagement of Mayan communities in the United States. And with his permission, I took this quote from his dissertation. I have the link there also that you can read later if you like. Claudia was a mom speaker and mother of two, and she said that the people of the school here do not know that I speak another language other than Spanish. I tell my son to tell the teachers to speak to us in Mam is the Mayan language, because that is the language that I understand. It would be nice if they spoke to me in my first language, but they always speak to me in Spanish or English. We have told them that they can talk to us in Mam, but they don't do anything. And Claudia, in the dissertation, in one of the findings that Gomez Portillo revealed in his dissertation was that first, the Spanish that schools were using to talk to families it was a Spanish that was very technical. It was very kind of translation method, and it didn't even make sense for Spanish speakers. It was very technical Spanish that it's just, it didn't translate well, the message. But in addition to that, it was a repertoire in Spanish, a register that indigenous communities in that school did not have access to. So even though the school was thinking that by using Spanish to share messages with the community was going to understand or become more involved, that was really not helping. So there were, the efforts were not bearing fruits, and they were not reaching this particular group of students and families, okay? So language is definitely an aspect of vulnerability when it comes to indigenous students and families. So we have to be aware of this. And then, you know, more and more I wondered if all of the resources that they use to share all of this communication in Spanish, which probably was a lot of resources, and if it was not helpful because the school had a large population of indigenous speakers, if it was not helpful, I wonder if they were even interested in learning that about their families. So they just assumed that the family spoke Spanish. And, you know, I don't know. That was not part of the dissertation, but I just kept wondering after I continued to read Gomez Portillo's findings. But this is a good introduction, kind of indigenous voices, a reality, to get us started with vulnerability. And vulnerability is something that I've been exploring more and more because it really interests me when I think about vulnerability and the way that we have embraced it in education conversations, education discussions, is that when we think about vulnerability, we think about situations and factors that happen outside of schools. Oh yes, they're vulnerable students, they're vulnerable populations, because we're thinking about the community, the society, right? But then I feel that this is really an issue for schools, because from this perspective, then when we describe students or families as vulnerable, we think about everything that's happening outside of the school, but then we don't have the opportunity to look inwards to see what's happening inside of the school that is placing additional vulnerabilities onto them. Okay, so 2 points here. In my view, this issue of looking at vulnerability from the outside as a social problem and not as an educational problem is one that identifies vulnerability as a descriptor that exists and occurs only outside of the educational institution, and it expropriates educational institutions of all their responsibility to identify and eradicate inequality in their learning process. And I kept seeing this again and again and again in schools, that when they say they're vulnerable populations, they have different names for it: at risk, vulnerable, you know, low socioeconomic, however you want to describe it, right? There are many names for it. Usually the fault or the weight of this terminology is placed on society, not on educational systems. Again, that's a problem. That's a problem because then schools don't take appropriate support. They don't realize that some of the practices that they are incorporating in their schools are actually what are adding additional layers of vulnerability to students and to families. Like, for example, Claudia, let me go back here. Claudia's example here, using Spanish, which was not very helpful for her and for the community that the school was serving, was adding additional layers of vulnerability. Now, some examples here of how vulnerability happens in schools. These are just very, very small examples. Many more out there. But again, I like to add a lot of text in my slides. As you can see, I just wanted to give you some ideas here. I believe that vulnerability is not a personal characteristic, which is something that is often used in schools, but it's actually an imposed condition. And I keep thinking more about this when I think of vulnerability. And when people say in schools, oh yes, they're vulnerable, they're at risk, they're low socioeconomic, I don't think about it as something that happens outside of schools, but as an imposed condition, something that the school system itself is imposing on children, on indigenous students specifically. And for me, this is done by erasing their indigenous identities, languages, and cultures, assuming and forcing the term Latino, Latinx, Latin, Hispanic, this idea of Spanish umbrella, that is placing Indigenous students into a condition of vulnerability. I'm going to explain now why. Lack of support, academic and non-academic resources, safety, protection, and conditions available in US for Indigenous youth. This is very important. You see, here's the thing. The reality is in Latin America, still today, and I was just reading last week, especially in Guatemala, which is one of the countries with the largest populations of indigenous groups in that part of the world. In Latin America and in Guatemala, indigenous leaders and indigenous groups, families continue to be displaced and killed because the government and people in power want to take their lands, want to take the places where they live. And they just, they're killed presently. They're being killed. So children, indigenous students, they arrive in schools with this trauma, with this reality. That's something they're experiencing, either firsthand or someone they know in their community. So many times, and you will see this in Latin America, there is a friction between non-indigenous and indigenous groups. And there is always this idea of racism, and especially non-indigenous groups and communities in Latin American countries, they have this perspective of indigenous people being less educated, or always looking down on them, discriminating them, or discriminate against them as well. Indigenous people usually in Latin American countries have less opportunities. When what happens is, when you take both of these populations into US schools, into this ESOL program umbrella, and you label everyone as Latino, Hispanic, Spanish speakers, the reality is that all of those frictions and tensions are going to continue to happen in the classroom. Even if teachers are unaware of this, students are still going to have those same conflicts. And I experienced them firsthand, where Spanish-speaking non-Indigenous students will replicate these ideologies of discrimination, of name calling, of putting Indigenous students down and calling them illiterate and all of these things. So we have to be very aware of who our Indigenous students are and what's happening in our classrooms. Because again, if we just throw everybody in the same classroom without being aware of what's happening or the situations that could be replicated from the realities in Latin America, then we're putting them in a vulnerable situation. And we're not even giving them the opportunity to tell us what's happening because we're not aware of who they are. So something to think about. Replicating, this is kind of what I was sharing with you previously, replicating colonial ideologies and practices, okay? And I always, in my experience, I kept seeing, even from Spanish-speaking teachers, let me say this, and it has to be said, even from Spanish-speaking teachers, this idea of reading and writing, the things that some Spanish teachers will tell me, oh no, this student, his Spanish is terrible, this, that, and other not very nice things. And then I would get into arguments with them, and I would tell them, how can you say this about your student? So this idea of literacy and Spanish language, and as being kind of separating the intelligent people from the non-intelligent people, all of these ideologies, colonial ideologies and practices, they're very much present in US schools, let me tell you, very much present in ESOL classes, in Spanish language classrooms, and in other classrooms as well. I remember in the schools that I was always emailing the teachers, I was always emailing the administrations, letting everybody know, look, do you know we have Indigenous students? Do you know we have this many languages in our school? No one ever cared for it. No one asked me for resources. I always share, do you want to have training? Do you want to have resources? Do you want to get to know more about your Indigenous students? And no one was ever interested. They just called everybody Latino, everybody speaks Spanish, and that's it. And they were even having issues with English learners, but that's another webinar, as we know. So something to keep in mind. You see, the reality is that, especially for teachers who are not ESOL, within the ESOL department, we do know that some teachers have issues with English learners, but Indigenous students, they're kind of double vulnerable, because of the reality imposed in schools is that they're not only ESOL, but they're also indigenous. So they're doubly vulnerable in schools. Subtractive schooling, and it's this idea, Valenzuela, this idea of when we think about indigenous languages and Spanish, kind of what I was telling you about Spanish teachers specifically, and how teachers view indigenous students, indigenous languages, also the way that they learn, which is different from students who had the opportunity to go to formal education throughout their developmental years and do not have any formal schooling gaps. Sometimes indigenous students have gaps in education because the quality of education provided and offered to indigenous communities in Latin America is terrible for the most part. So, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. So something to keep in mind. So when we see indigenous students struggling in our classroom, and I want to leave this question here for further thought. When we see indigenous students struggling in our classrooms, we must ask ourselves, what vulnerabilities are being imposed on this student by school personnel and the school district? And as teachers, we have to ask ourselves, how can I remove these imposed vulnerabilities? And I'm just realizing that it's 41, so I'm gonna go a little bit faster now because I want questions and answers. I want to hear from you. So, and I have a lot more to talk about. So how can we affirm indigenous identities from our students in the classroom? Summarizing this, as I said, I want to give us at least 10 minutes to talk. Very, very important. Let's shift the perspective that indigenous students are not alive. Let's stop talking about indigenous groups, indigenous languages, and indigenous people as people from the past. Indigenous people are here. Indigenous languages are here. Indigenous people are very, very present in our lives. Let's address the dispossession of lands, territories, livelihoods. Let's address the marginalization, the discrimination that's happening against indigenous students. If we talk about and we celebrate Spanish-speaking cultures, why can't we do the same with indigenous cultures? Why? That's something that we have to think about. Let's do that. Let's do that. Okay. So I'll leave this here for you. Like I said, I want to talk to you. So let me just keep going through this. Do you know the word race, words, it should be there, plural. Race and racism did not exist in indigenous languages from Abya Yala, from that part of the world, which is called the Americas. Race and racism did not exist in those languages. The words race and racism were introduced by people and languages of colonization. You will not find in indigenous languages those two words, okay? They were introduced by Portuguese, English, and Spanish. Social emotional needs, let me go very quickly. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna keep going because I do want to talk to all of you, okay? So let me just keep going through this very quickly and write in the chat box if you want me to spend a little bit more time on some of the slides here. Okay, so I'm very, very passionate about social emotional learning. It's something that I've seen firsthand with my students, and it's something that I'm very much passionate about now, advocating for social emotional learning. The first part is supporting indigenous students in schools. Tell and show them that you care, okay? The most important part for, in my experience, indigenous students, as I shared with you, they usually arrive with experiences, traumatic experiences that may prompt them, not always, so I'm not generalizing, those experiences may prompt them to make their identities invisible, their languages invisible. I have had students who identified as, instead of, for example, Guatemalan, because Guatemala has a large population of indigenous people, that student would identify as Mexican because he didn't want to be associated with Guatemalans or with indigenous people, because his words, he wanted to be successful and he didn't see himself being indigenous and successful, which was very saddening for me to learn that. But that was how his reality affected his worldview, right? So we have to start talking to them and let them know that everyone in the classroom is safe. That's something that I started doing with all my students, especially during the first week. And I very, very clearly, I identify for my indigenous students, you are here, you're safe, you're protected, and no one is going to make fun of you. No one is going to discriminate against you. And if those people do, you let me know and they will be in trouble. Very clearly, I will let them know, because I always knew that I had indigenous students throughout my classrooms. let students, Indigenous students, know that you see them, that you're protecting them, and that you know what's happening. Create a safe space for them. They need it. Okay. I have here some links that you can see. I started doing a lot of social emotional learning, especially restorative circles. This is a picture from the third bullet point here, peacemaking circles in the English classroom. That was a collaboration with my mentor, Miss McNair. I love her. She's wonderful. So let me just keep going very quickly. Another one here, visibility, as I was sharing with you, let them know, let them feel validated. Let them know that their culture is also important. I started asking my students, my Indigenous students, how can I incorporate more of your languages or your cultures in our classes? Because yes, I would incorporate other cultures. I had Chinese, Vietnamese, Arabic speaking, mostly from Afghanistan students, so a lot of Latinx students. But yes, but I wanted to include also my Indigenous students' cultures. So I asked them, how can I include your culture into your classes as well? Okay, they will tell you when they feel comfortable. So also make sure that you let, and I was always the problematic teacher for this, I would always let my administrators know that they're responsible for my students' well-being, my Indigenous students' well-being and success. They need, for some of the students who, especially if they have very, very strong print literacy in their Indigenous languages, by law, they need dictionaries. Why are we giving dictionaries to everybody else in their languages and not to my Indigenous students? No, that's not appropriate. Okay, schools need to also are responsible for recognizing Indigenous students, languages, and cultures. And this is something that I continue to see in central office when Indigenous families will go to register their children, and they would tell them, we speak Quiche, we speak Mam, we speak Ichil, we speak Quechua, other Indigenous languages, and then we just place them under the umbrella of Hispanic or Latino. No, we have to acknowledge the fact that we have Indigenous students and families in our school. They're not Hispanic, they're not Indigenous, they're Indigenous. They're telling you that they speak that language. So we have to address that. Sorry, I'm very passionate about that. And that was a problem that I kept having with central office when I was working with them. Also include Indigenous languages in your instruction. And this is something that I really like doing with my students. And I would always say, especially I like teaching newcomers in level 1, I would always tell my students, we're going to do an activity where you can write it in your native language and English, like we do English and native language. And then so on the left-hand side, we see here a student who wrote a report. We were writing a report here. And then he decided to write it in Mam, who is, that's his first language, and then in English. And then on the other one here, the second one, we were doing an activity. I really like doing poetry. That's the next slide. And then I asked everyone to do poetry, of course, in English, but in the other languages that they spoke. And then he said, well, I speak Mam in Spanish. And well, then do it in all 3 of the languages, right? And this is it. This is his beautiful, beautiful poem. And I'm glad he was able to share that with the class. He was very happy, very proud. So create opportunities for them to include the languages. Don't say, write it in Spanish and English. No, write it in your native language. Make that opportunity, that space for them to use it, okay? Another Indigenous voices here that I want to share with you. This is one of my students, and he graduated. I'm so proud of him. He graduated this year, and he shared with me this picture, and he shared with me, I asked him, Mario, please share your words. I'm going to talk to teachers. What do you want me to tell them? And he shared this with me. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. My voice is kind of cracking a little bit. He said, my name is Mario Pan Ac. I am from Guatemala, and I speak 3 languages, Quechua, Spanish, and English. Something I would like to see in schools that I do not see is teachers being interested in and acknowledging my language. For example, in Mr. Penton's class, he liked to listen to me speak my language, and he liked learning words from me. For example, I taught him, and then he shared some words. Recently, we were talking, I still talk to many of my students, and I'm like, Mario, you have to teach me more words. I remember, and then I share some words that he shared with me. He's like, you still remember? I'm like, of course, you taught me. So you see, and he was very happy. So give them that, give them the opportunity to let them know I care. I care about you. I care about your culture. I care about your language. Okay, we're getting close to the Q&A. I'm going to go very quickly through this. Other examples here. The second picture, especially the picture here with storytelling, there is an article coming out in December, I think, about this. So, you know, I'll be glad to share the article, but I'm just going to go very quickly through the slides because I want to hear from you. But storytelling, please, it's one of the best, in my experiences, one of the best ways to learn not only Indigenous students, but in general, newcomers. So I do recommend it. And then to finalize this here very quickly, very important points. This is why I write a lot in the slides, because I do tend to talk a lot, and I give you this for future consideration. There is such a thing, and I have experienced that, because many Indigenous students sadly receive below level education in their native countries because of all this discrimination that I've been talking to you about, is structural discrimination that happens in their native countries, and the government does not allocate enough resources for Indigenous education. Usually their education is subpar, and many of them receive education that is really terrible, because then in elementary school they receive education in Indigenous languages, for example, but then in middle high school, then they jump into instruction only in Spanish. That's really not helpful, because then what happened is that I have seen students who speak a little bit of they speak their Indigenous languages, so their language domain of listening and speaking is very, very strong in their Indigenous languages. But then reading and writing, they don't know how to read or write very well in their Indigenous languages. And then they know how to read and write a little bit better in Spanish, but they don't know how to speak and listen in Spanish very well. They're still learning. So the 4 language domains have never been fully developed in a single language. And you know, that's very difficult for them, because then when they get to the US for the first time, they have to learn the 4 language domains in 1 language, which is English. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult. So something to keep in mind, especially if they have limited or interrupted formal education. That's another topic, another presentation, but that adds additional layers of issues. Also, something that I do want to clarify here is that Indigenous languages are very different from Spanish, and some letters are not present in the same way. Very clearly explaining this. They do not exist in the same way or in the same sound that they exist like in Spanish, okay? So they also have additional vowels or specific consonants. For example, here in the word in the language here shuk, and the second bullet on the bottom, the B and the apostrophe, that's not the same as B in Spanish. So in their language, B and apostrophe, that's a consonant. Okay, they don't have such a thing as just the B. Okay. Again, the letters B, C, D, F, G, double L, Z do not exist in Mayan languages in the same way that we use them in English or Spanish. So again, it's not, we cannot think of them speaking in Spanish and then it's going to be easily translated into English because they already know the alphabet. No, it's not like that. There are additional layers. Okay. So let me just go very quickly here to some of the examples, and let's do question and answer soon because I want to hear from you. These are some of the examples that I started using in my experience. Spanish teachers, when you have very good Spanish teachers who are really there to work with you and your students, they're the best possible resources that you can tap and support one another. And if you can do parallel teaching, especially for Indigenous students who have interrupted schooling, it's very difficult for them to catch up quickly. So if you do parallel teaching, pretty much the same that you teach in your TESOL class, the Spanish teacher can teach in their Spanish class, especially for reading and writing, because unfortunately we don't have Indigenous languages in our schools. So we have to go with the next language that they know, which is Spanish. And if you can kind of parallel teach the same things in both classes, their level of proficiency really, really increases very, very fast in print literacy, reading and writing. Okay, so this is an example of something that my colleague and I did in 2016. We started working with this program where we would collaborate, and everything that I was doing in my for that particular student, you know, I was differentiating instruction for that particular student. She did the same in Spanish class, and we started teaching same vocabulary, same, you know, like wording, words, alphabet, all of these things at the same time. And by the end of the school year, he started writing a few sentences, almost a paragraph. So that's pretty big for a student who didn't know how to write his name in the beginning of the school year. Okay. And then I shared with you here some resources, something to keep in mind. And I'm going to leave you with this. You can read this later because I want to hear from you. But for some students, the idea of reading for pleasure might be a new concept. So we have to keep that in mind, not only for reading and writing, but also the perspective, the idea of reading. It's something that has to be explained, explored, providing opportunities for them to engage in that in school so they can start exploring the pleasure of reading for pleasure. That's an idea that needs to be explored in our print literacy classrooms. Okay, I have some resources here that were very, very helpful for me when I was teaching students with interrupted education, Indigenous students with interrupted schooling. I really, really recommend them. Those resources were wonderful, especially the mini reader collection. It was a fantastic resource, okay? But let me just, I apologize, I wanted to give us more time, but let's start talking now. I'm going to stop. And I would love to see your questions and your comments, please. And I see here, thank you very much for your comments. We have some questions here. Helene, thank you so much. Let me start with you here. What do we do when children and or family members deny their Maya background or simply demur when asked if the school can just use Spanish with them? That's a difficult, situation, because usually if they are denying their background, there is fear attached to it. And there are wonderful organizations that are doing a lot of advocacy work for them. There is an organization called Cielo. Let me write it down here. Cielo, that's the acronym. It's a fantastic organization. There was also the International Mayan League. There are also smaller organizations, indigenous organizations in different states that are doing specific work. What I would do is I would contact, and this is something that the school should be doing, having open communication with those, especially if they know that they have indigenous students and indigenous families. They need to start collaborating with those indigenous groups, indigenous institutions, to see how they can help them, because then they can bring someone who can talk to them. If they're denying or making, they want to make their background invisible, they do not feel safe. There is an issue there that is making them feel vulnerable, unsafe, and they do not want to disclose their identity because there is a fear of persecution, discrimination, or even death. They have seen it firsthand in their native languages, in their native countries, when they speak their native languages. So that's why they do not want to disclose it, okay? So pushing them to disclose their identity and their languages, that's not going to be helpful, okay? We have to make connections with those organizations that they can help us then. And that's something that I really feel that every school district that knows that they have indigenous communities in their schools, that they're serving indigenous families, they should start contacting those indigenous communities, community organizations in their districts, in their states. There are other, like I said, there are other indigenous organizations, associations in different states that right now are escaping my mind, but I can share them with you if you email me. And these two big ones that I shared with you, the International Mayan League, they're doing fantastic work. Cielo, they're also doing fantastic work, especially with interpreters and translators. That's something that schools should also do, include more translators and interpreters of indigenous languages. We have Natalia. There are strategies. Helene, please let me know if that helps. There are strategies for acculturation, which include assimilation, integration, etc. What if the family of these children is so wanting to not be associated with an indigenous culture that they want to completely assimilate, and they impose that on their children? Yes, Natalia, and that's something that sadly, yes, it echoes your Helene's question. And I see here Maria Luisa also similar to similar comment. That's something that we cannot push families to against their will, pretty much, right? But what we can do is create a space of collaboration with those organizations so they feel safe. Let me give you an example. I was working with this Quechua speaker mother, and she's a higher education student in a university, and then she's a mother of 3. And she's not teaching Quechua to her children. She's teaching them Spanish and English. And there are many reasons for that. But in my conversations with her, at the end of the day, she said, look, I'm a single mother. I have 3 children, and then I want to teach them the languages that are going to help them. I don't have time when I go back home to start teaching them Quechua, but this is something that I have started doing. And then she started telling me the story of how she started feeling very isolated from her Quechua roots and everything. But then she found an organization called Quechua Hatari. And that's also a group, Quechua. I'm gonna write it here, hold on. I cannot multitask. Check it out. And I have the article that I can share with you. It's in Spanish, but I can share with you. And then she started becoming more involved with this organization. They do yearly gatherings and celebrations. And what they do now is that she takes her children to this organization and these events every year. And now they're starting to kind of return to their roots, return to the culture, because they feel safe in that environment. The children now have their long hair, part of the culture, and they feel happy, and they feel that was another incident that they had in school, because children were bullying them because they had their long hair. And then the mother had to go and talk to everyone in school and let them know that's part of the culture, so the administrators could take additional measures. So it all goes back to feeling safe. What conditions are we creating in the school? What resources are school creating in supporting and giving to Indigenous families, especially when they know they're serving Indigenous families? They're not just going to disclose, many of them are not just going to disclose that they're Indigenous because they don't feel safe. They just don't feel safe. Also, it can be the matter of practicality. Yes, Juliana, so that's what I was saying. Yes, Spanish can be seen as a way more, for more access to resources. Absolutely. Spanish can be seen as the better platform for employment. And that is the reality. That is the reality. And I do see, sadly, that in 2nd or 3rd generations of Indigenous families, but that happens also, sadly, in the United States with many other, not only Indigenous communities, but also Spanish-speaking communities, Asian communities who are migrating after the 2nd or 3rd generation. Sadly, they just lose their languages. But that's another presentation. But yes, so we're talking specifically Indigenous families arriving right away, right? But yes, I can definitely see how that's an issue that they have with Spanish. What I do see, what I do feel that happens the most is that Indigenous families, especially groups that are very close together, they won't speak Spanish amongst themselves. They will speak their Indigenous language. So the larger the group of Indigenous speakers in that community, the more the language and the culture will be preserved. That's what I see. I keep seeing more and more. Yes, showing genuine, thank you, Juliana, for that. Genuine respect to Indigenous knowledges is critical. How do we decorate our classrooms? 100%, 100%. Do we invite guests from community organizations into our classroom? Do we invite Indigenous communities and Indigenous speakers to our classrooms? Let me give you an example here. And Shane, I'm sorry, I know I promised I would only take an hour. I'm sorry, I'm almost done here. And I would love to hear from all of you also, please, if you want to speak. But let me tell you something that really shocked me the first year when I was working at a high school, is that they did a career day. And for my students in the TESOL department, the only speakers that they brought were people who were doing like lawn, like cutting the lawn, like mowing the lawn, or kind of manual work. They didn't have any lawyers or any career, which there is nothing wrong with that. Work is work. But why would you give only newcomer students, ESOL students, why would you only have invited speakers who are individuals who are not professionals? You have to bring a variety of presenters, a variety of professionals into the classroom, including Indigenous speakers, okay? All right, so let me I'm going to turn it into Shane, and if anyone would like to share their thoughts, any last thoughts, please let me know, okay? But Shane, thank you so much. You've been very gracious, and I know I went a lot over time.
I know, no, I mean, we're so grateful. Thank you so much, Dr. Luis. And I really hate to interrupt because I'm so touched and inspired. But we are kind of like running out of time. And I know there's never enough time to continue this important topic. So thank you again, Dr. Luis, for this wonderful presentation. And I also want to thank our audience members who are so engaged. I learned a lot. And of course, we will be having more webinars planned, and we will be more than happy to see you in our next webinar. And please stay connected. Reach out to Dr. Luis. I will definitely reach out to him and learn more from him. But thank you to all of you, and have a wonderful day.